This is a production of Cornell University.
Welcome to the podcast of Mann Library's Chats in the Stacks Book Talk series. In today's talk, originally presented at Mann Library on October 25, 2007, Dr. Craig Adler of Cornell's Department of Neurobiology and Behavior profiles some of the key explorers, academics, physicians, zookeepers, and amateur naturalists who have studied reptiles and amphibians for centuries and together have developed the modern field of herpetology.
Thanks very much, Janet. And before I begin, I'd also like to thank Eveline Ferretti. Thank you, Eveline, for doing all the arrangements. Well, I want to talk about the new book, but as Janet has said, it's actually part of a series. It's volume 2 of a series that began in 1989. Here's the title page of volume 1, which appeared on the occasion of the First World Congress of Herpetology in England, and then volume 2, which appeared this last July, is on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Society for the Study of Amphibians and Reptiles, which is the largest international herpetological society. As many of you know, my own major research line is animal behavior, and secondarily it is in systematics. But all of my research, well, almost all of my research, has dealt with amphibians and reptiles. And over time, I've developed an interest in the history of biological studies on amphibians and reptiles, and of course, inevitably, the people who conducted those studies. Now, I recognize there are other slices of biological history. One could do an ornithological slice or an entomological one, or anatomy, genetics, etc., and each is interesting in its own right. But today I'm going to focus, of course, on herpetology. And I see a number of herpetologists in the audience here. So I know that some of these slides are going to take a little while to load. I'm sure the herpetologists in the audience won't disagree with my next headline. And I hope by the end of my talk, some of the rest of you might feel that herpetologists are interesting too. Many people who begin with an interest in reptiles and amphibians or with other subjects begin with an interest in the organism themselves, and quite often it comes during childhood. Their mom or their dad or some other relative or a teacher gets them interested. And only later do they decide what it is that they could do with them in terms of research. But in order to do that, and most of these people become behaviorists or ecologists, anatomists, evolutionary biologists, they have to have a very broad knowledge of the animal. You can't just deal with one facet of the organism. If you're to understand its behavior, you have to know its evolutionary history and ecology and so forth, and vice versa. So you really have to know the whole organism, organismic biology. And inevitably, as I've said, this leads to an interest in the field, the history of the field, and the people. And each of these books is divided into 3 sections. The first part are the biographies, which I wrote, and then my colleagues wrote 2 other sections, an index to authors and academic lineages. And I'll show you an academic lineage, which I think you might find interesting, because it is a Cornell lineage. Now, this next slide I think is going to take a little time to load. What you will see is a sample biography, just to give you the flavor of what the biographies look like. They're mostly a full page in length. Some are a little shorter, some are as much as 2 pages long. And this one is for an American herpetologist. He also worked in entomology and some other fields, but herpetology was one of his major ones, John LeConte. And he was active during the early part of the 19th century. For each person, I give their full name, their aliases. Yes, some of them have aliases. Many of them have alternate spellings of their names. their places and dates of birth and death, how their interest began, their education. Many of them were explorers and went on expeditions, and those expedition routes are extremely important to know when you're trying to understand where an organism, a specimen in a museum is from. You have to know where they went, who their research associates and students were. You'll see there are a lot of connections in my talk and in my book. Who was a student of whom? Who were their students? Who were their closest collaborators? Where their collections are located, if there are any today, and of course what their primary contributions to biology and especially herpetology are. And at the end of each account there are references, there is a portrait and a signature, as you can see here, and then various notes. Now just a couple of words about the LeContes. When you say the LeContes, I'm really talking about 5 naturalists. They were Huguenots. They were chased out of Normandy by Louis XIV, persecuted on religious grounds. And they came to the U.S., and in this large family, it turns out that 5 of them have become naturalists, and quite famous ones. 3 of them, for example, became members of the National Academy of Sciences. One of them became president of the University of California, and another became, before John Henry Comstock, America's leading entomologist. But John LeConte, who is shown here, he had a military career. He was a member of the topographical engineers, mapping the country. And then after he retired, he really turned to natural history, which I think was his real interest all along. And he discovered and named many of the most common species in eastern North America. And here are pictures of a few. Here's a little salamander, the dwarf siren. If you look closely, you'll see it has external gills behind the head, and it has 4 legs. See the little limb there? But you'll notice, if you look real hard, you still won't see any hind legs, because there aren't any. Here's the gray tree frog and the wood turtle. These are both local species. He discovered and named those. He also named the pickerel frog, the wood frog, the chorus frog, the red-bellied turtle, and many, many others. Now, prior to 1900 or so, there were no herpetologists per se. Most of these were general naturalists. They might have had a couple of areas of specific interest, but they really had rather broad interests. And many of these people, among their many interests, were also interested in reptiles and amphibians. And here are 8 such people. Most of them will be names known to you, I'm sure. Starting over here with Conrad Gesner, a Swiss physician who developed the first encyclopedia of animals, the Historia Animalium, in many volumes. Here's John Ray, the best English naturalist before Darwin. He's the one who developed the species concept, which then Linnaeus later capitalized on. He got to be interested in natural history from his mother, who was the village herbalist, and she would take him along on little trips out into the countryside. And I've actually been out into that countryside. It's a very lovely place, and very much as it was in Ray's day. The next one is Linnaeus, of course, the Swedish botanist primarily, who invented binomial nomenclature. Now, I'm sorry to say, Dr. Linnaeus abhorred herps. He once said in Latin, "Terribilia sunt opera tua, O Domine," which means, "Terrible are thy works, O Lord." Well, we'll forgive him for that. The next person is Georges Cuvier, the famous French comparative naturalist and comparative anatomist and paleontologist, who really brought those fields together. It was important to bring our knowledge of living organisms together with our knowledge of fossil ones. A number of people who worked in herpetology in years past were members of the nobility, and here are 2 in the lower left. Here is Prince Maximilian of Wied-Neuwied. He was an early explorer, first of Brazil in the 18 teens, right after the Napoleonic Wars. He was actually imprisoned during that war. He was an officer in the Prussian army and was captured by Napoleon's troops. And when he got out, he went to Brazil. Enough of this military work. And then he came to America and actually was an early explorer up the Missouri River and essentially retracing the route of Lewis and Clark. Next to him, you might even without looking at the caption, you might recognize the face on this person. Yes, he is a nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. This is his nephew, who was one of the very best vertebrate biologists of his day. And here's a face that anybody who's been on the second floor of Corson Hall will see his portrait hanging there. Louis Agassiz, a Swiss-American zoologist who became really the father of zoology in this country. We'll come back to him a little later when we get to the Cornell story. This last person may be someone that you don't recognize, Ivan Ivanovich Schmalhausen, who in the first half of the 20th century was the Soviet Union's leading evolutionary biologist. His interest was the origin of limbs of vertebrates, and especially the transition from fish to amphibians, to terrestriality. But he became a victim of Lysenkoism. Trofims Lysenko, who became a favorite of Stalin and then of Khrushchev, believed in the inheritance of acquired characteristic and essentially stalled genetic study in the Soviet Union for 20 years. He did not even believe in the existence of genes and chromosomes. Well, this was a problem, of course, for an evolutionary biologist and someone who did do genetic studies, such as Schmalhausen, and who didn't want to betray his principles. And, of course, he fell afoul of Lysenko and the Soviet government. And in 1948, in the newspaper, the government newspaper Izvestia, the Soviet Minister of Higher Education had this to say about this gentleman. Academician Schmalhausen, he was a member of their academy, denies the inheritance of acquired characteristics. He finds that evolution depends upon mutations which originate directly in the germ cells of organisms. That was his fault. Well, Schmalhausen was arrested. He was put on trial, found guilty. All of his posts were revoked, his professorship, his directorship of the institute. His assistants were dismissed, and much of his equipment and library were destroyed. Now, eventually, Lysenko himself was deposed in 1964 after Khrushchev was deposed, but a little too late. He was deposed in 1964, and as you can see, Schmalhausen died the year before. We always have to remember the context that people work in, and some people work in horrendous conditions. In this case, political persecution. There were others who fell afoul of Lysenko who ended up in prison and died there. And these are people who kept true to their beliefs in truth in science, and they paid heavily for it. Well, now I'd like to talk about a few specific individuals and their contributions to herpetology. The first of these, starting with the very beginning, is the most ancient person in my book, in either of the volumes, and this is a person that you may not have heard of, but you should know who Nicolò Leoniceno is. Because he was an Italian physician by profession and a Greek scholar, and it wasn't just that he published the first printed book on reptiles, but it was because of his knowledge of Greek and his interest in making sure that what he was teaching in the university about medicine was correct and true to the ancient scholars. And by that we mean Galen in particular, and Aristotle, the Greek scholars, and then much of that information had been copied, translated into Latin, and copied by Pliny the Elder, some 14 centuries before Leoniceno. Well, as you can see, as a boy, by the age of 12, this Leoniceno mastered Latin and Greek. He could recite all of the orations of Cicero, for example, in Latin. from memory. He became a professor of theoretical medicine at a university in Italy. And you may wonder, professor of theoretical medicine, what's theoretical about it? Well, what teachers did in those days, they didn't go and look at bodies or specimens. They were taking the information from the ancient sources, mostly as copied, translated and copied by Pliny, and then making deductions from that to apply to specific circumstances that they were seeing, rather than making direct observations. The ancients must have had it right, and therefore, who are we to question the ancients? Well, Leoniceno did question the ancients, and he was one of the very first to question them, to find errors. And some of the errors should be self-evident. I mean, there were no printing presses until 1454, and so all of this information had to be copied again and again and again. And from Pliny's time, for 14 centuries, it had to be copied. And of course, copyists make mistakes. Little ones here, maybe big ones over there. And in the first place, Pliny mistranslated a lot of what he read from the Greek. So there were errors of at least two sorts. And because Leoniceno could understand Latin and Greek, he knew that the errors were there. And some of them led to recommendations, medical recommendations, which were actually potentially injurious to human health. So that was his concern, to go back and revive Galenic medicine. And therefore, the University of Ferrara at this time became the leading medical school in Europe. And Leoniceno was the leading physician of his day. But when you challenge authorities such as Galen and Aristotle, and in this case especially Pliny, who was, after all, a fellow Italian, this was heresy. And he was attacked in print, and it took enormous intellectual courage to stand up to this, but he stood up to it, and as you can see from his birth and death dates, he lived a very long life, the age of 94. But he had a special interest in vipers. Well, why in vipers? Well, here is a woodcut from the first illustrated surgical book published in Germany in 1497. And here you can see a patient being treated by 3 doctors. Now the patient, this is fairly common in the old surgical text. This person is called the wound man. There always had to be somebody in the picture that had one or more wounds. And if you look on this poor guy, he's got a snake wrapped around his left leg, and here's a rabid dog down here. And you can see the wound on that leg. Here's a scorpion over here, here's a spider over here, so he's multiply wounded. But this is a fairly typical thing. But vipers, of course, any of these organisms were of particular interest to doctors because they could kill people. And they needed to understand how these animals, in the case of vipers, envenomated the victim. Well, unfortunately, Leoniceno couldn't figure that out. It remained for a much later series of Italians to figure that out. But he also published the first book in herpetology, and here's the title page from it. On Vipers, as you can see, published in 1498. He published some other works, and I brought a copy of one of his later works published in 1518. If you want to come up afterwards, it's on that table over there. I'd be happy to show it to you. Well, now let's jump ahead 2 centuries to an English naturalist who spent much of his time in North America. This is Mark Catesby. He was an amateur naturalist. He only had a grade school education. Here's that name, John Ray, again, the English naturalist I mentioned a few moments ago. Fortunately, John Ray just lived 15 kilometers down the road. How lucky could a guy get? So he learned some natural history from John Ray, and then he went to visit his sister, who by this time lived in Williamsburg. And he learned the local fauna and illustrated it. This is a printed version of the bullfrog. Unfortunately, as you can see here, there's no known portrait of Catesby, just his signature. So he collected specimens, made drawings. There was a second visit in the 1720s, Carolinas, Virginia, Georgia, the Bahamas, Spanish Florida. And he wanted to produce some books of illustrations in folio so that the animals could be illustrated in natural size. Now, some of them were actually bigger than even these pages, and so he'd have to bend the neck of the bird around in order to get it all on there, but he made them life-size, and he put them on natural backgrounds, or at least put some plants in the background. As you can see, there's some plant material here. But he couldn't find a publisher. This was very expensive to produce. It has 220 plates, hand-colored. So to keep the expenses down, he actually learned to make his own engravings. And then he and his family proceeded to hand-color all these drawings. Well, how many were there? Well, there are 220 plates in each of the 2 volumes, and there are 156 sets that we know were produced. 156 sets. By the way, 2 of them are down in the lower campus in Olin Library. That comes to, as you can see here, 34,320 plates. And this was the family's income for the rest of Mark Catesby's life, was to color these drawings and sell the books one at a time. They were not cheap, as you can imagine. But this is how he supported the family. This is a name that may be known to you from the name of this animal here, drawn by Catesby, the bullfrog. This is what we used to call Rhanolithodeides, but now Howie Evans tells me I have to call it Lithodeides catesbiana, named for Mark Catesby. He was an amateur, as I said, but notice in those days, very active amateurs could actually make their way into the Royal Society. Well, now we'll move another century later. We're moving right along here, time-wise. A century later, most of the naturalists, not all, but most of the naturalists by this time were professionally trained, unlike John Ray, unlike Mark Catesby. And by professionally trained, we mean normally they would get MD degrees, medical degrees. There were no PhDs at that time in the United States. This was a German invention in the early 1800s. I think the first one in the U.S. was at the end of that century. I think Johns Hopkins was first, and if I'm not mistaken, Cornell was second. This is John Edwards Holbrook, a medical doctor trained at Brown in Pennsylvania, and like many in that day, he then went to Europe for additional training in Edinburgh, which was a very common place for American medical people to go for training, and then he went to Paris. He then went to Charleston, his place of birth, became a professor, and he had a medical practice, but as best I can tell, he was a rather indifferent physician. I mean, he had a good bedside manner. He would start an operation, but then he would very quickly turn it over to some other people to finish off for him. Because I think his interest really was in amphibians and reptiles and fish. He also published on fish. And he discovered and named many of the most common amphibians and reptiles of especially eastern North America. And there's some pictures of them there at the bottom if you can see them. From left to right, we have a Blanding's turtle, a collared lizard, Bufo americanus, or now it has another name, but it's the common American toad here that lives in Ithaca. There's the scarlet king snake, and on the far right is the brown snake, sometimes called the decay snake, named for John Ellsworth Decay. So he was able to produce 2 editions of a major work. The first edition in 4 volumes, the second in 5. Here's the title page of one of them, and I brought one of those volumes here if you'd like to look at it later, and you'll see all the beautiful hand-colored plates that were produced for it. So he was able to begin the cataloging of the herpetofauna of North America. And notice he also became a member of the National Academy. But there were many other parts of the world at that time that were not at this stage of development, where they could start to catalog their fauna, that they had a pretty good first approximation to what they had. And one of those places, of course, was on the other side of the earth in China. And here, of course, the object of work was still exploration, and often quite dangerous exploration. This is Father Armand David, a Lazarist priest ordained in 1851. He then became a naturalist while he was still in France, and he wanted to go to China, partly to work at a boys' school for science, but also to do field work. And he arrived in Peking in 1862, and very quickly he discovered this deer that you see up here in the upper right corner, which hadn't been described before. This is Father David's deer, as it's now known as, or in the French, Père David's deer. There weren't very many left. They were extinct throughout most of China where they once lived. They were only alive in the imperial hunting grounds. And somehow he smuggled the skull and the skin out of Peking back to France. It was described as a new species, and then the French and English wanted specimens, so they wrote to the emperor, and live specimens were sent. Thank goodness, because at the time of the Boxer Rebellion, all of the remaining deer were killed and eaten for food in the imperial hunting grounds, and the animal became extinct in China, and it was only the breeding herd in England that allowed the animal to be reintroduced into China. Well, before 1840, China was a rather closed place. Not many people could get in, and if you did so at great risk. But the Opium Wars between Great Britain and China began to open China. The first wars were in the 1840s, and then again in 1860, and notice he arrived right after the Second Opium War. This allowed him to travel much more widely in China than would otherwise have been the case. And he went on 3 major expeditions. The first to Inner Mongolia, sort of north and west from Peking. He thought he was in Mongolia. It turns out he was really in what we now call Inner Mongolia. And notice he spent the better part of a year there. And then, a couple of years later, he went on a much more extensive expedition right into the center of China, into Sichuan, which is essentially center, and then went west from there into the border region of Tibet. And it was there that he made some other spectacular discoveries, including the giant panda. He obtained a skin and skull which were sent back to Paris, and somehow he actually got a living specimen, and it was sent from central China. Imagine this, in the 1860s, somehow this animal was sent all the way back to Paris, where it was put on display in the menagerie of the Natural History Museum. But for herpetologists, he discovered this animal right here on that same expedition. This is the Chinese giant salamander. It gets up to, well, in excess of 100 pounds and over 5 feet in length. It's the largest living amphibian. The Chinese now actually farm them and use them as food today. And this was named for him, Andreas Davidianus. And he discovered many other amphibians as well, which he then described and named. And so these were specimens, not only of animals, but of plants that he sent back to the museum in Paris. But just to give you an idea how rigorous it was, on one or several occasions, he was so close to death that they actually rendered the last rites of the Catholic Church because they didn't think he was going to survive. And on his last trip, you saw there was another expedition down there. He got so ill that going back to France, he actually had to go to Algeria first in order to sort of get the warmer temperatures, and he spent, I think, a year there before he felt healthy enough to go back to Paris. Well, now, what about Cornell's contribution to the history of herpetology? What about our students and our faculty? I'm not talking about current faculty and students, but historically. Well, the central figure in this story is this gentleman in the center here, Albert Hazen Wright. And I can't mention him without mentioning his wife, Anna Allen Wright, the sister of Arthur Allen, the founder of the Laboratory of Ornithology. Albert Wright got his PhD at Cornell in 1908, and besides his own research, he became the editor of the Handbooks of North American Natural History, which were published by Cornell University Press, written by the leading people in the field at that time, and he and his wife joined up to co-author 2 different series, one on frogs. It went through 3 editions. That little book you see there is the 2nd edition of the frog book, and then in 2 volumes on the right in green is the Handbook of Snakes. And these have been the standard references for these subjects for decades. And they've been reprinted. I think the snake volumes have been reprinted 15 times. Maybe it's up at 20 by now. Well, Albert Wright, notice, if you now look at lineages, now we're starting to look at the connections in terms of their training. Albert Wright, if you follow the lineage back, goes back to Louis Agassiz, then at Harvard. Agassiz was trained in Europe, in Munich with Lawrence Oken, and then he did his postdoctoral work, what we would call postdocs today, with Cuvier and Alexander von Humboldt, who at that time was spending most of his time in Paris. So those were his teachers. Agassiz then went to Harvard and trained a number of people there, and Jordan actually was not trained at Harvard by Agassiz. He was trained right here at Cornell by Agassiz because Agassiz was a visiting professor at Cornell. He was a close friend of Ezra Cornell's. He was present at the opening ceremonies of this university. And Jordan was a student here. By the way, notice Jordan's name is in capital letters, and the little key down here will tell you that those who are Cornell graduates have their names in caps. Jordan then went to Stanford as president and also established a school in ichthyology, and one of his students was Joseph Grinnell, who established a school in Berkeley. George Myers continued the herpetological and ichthyological tradition at Stanford. If you go over on the right-hand side, another student of Agassiz's was Whitman, who became a professor at Chicago, and through his student Adams, leads to Ruthven at Michigan, who established the Michigan School in Herpetology, and Ruthven's students, or his students' students, then went out to a variety of other schools, and pretty soon you can begin to see how the tapestry of North American herpetology, where the schools of herpetology developed. But one of these was clearly at Cornell. Agassiz's most famous doctoral student, Bert Green Wilder, came to Cornell, and he spent his entire career here. And one of his students was Albert Wright. Another student was Gage, who begat Kingsbury, who begat Adelman, if you will. All of these people published in herpetology, as did Wilder. Another student of Wilder's was Hugh Reed, an anatomist, who is the great-great-uncle of Amy McCune, who is professor in ecology and evolutionary biology. Well, now let's concentrate on Albert Wright. And as you can see, he had many doctoral students. And there are others. These are just the principal ones. Ray Coles, I'm going to talk about in more detail in a moment. And notice the little asterisk here. Anyone with an asterisk, Myers, Wright, Agassiz, their bios are in one or the other of those 2 volumes that I wrote. So we'll come back to Coles, but notice Coles had students that went off to Arizona and Cornell and once again to Berkeley. So you can see Berkeley has been multiply infected by Cornell-trained people. And then here's Sherman Bishop, who went to Rochester, developed a program there. If you follow all of Bishop's students, you would find the name Susan Henry, our dean, whose first work, by the way, her first publication was on salamander evolutionary biology. Here we have Gordon at Oregon State. Here's Hamilton, primarily a mammologist, also published in herpetology. A student of his was Perry Gilbert, the famous shark expert, also published in herpetology. He had a student who went to Washington. Here's another student who's sitting in the second row over here, Howie Evans, retired professor of anatomy in the veterinary college, and other students here, Barbara Stewart, Hecht at CUNY in New York City. Here is one of actually the most famous Chinese herpetologists, Lu Chengqiao, who got his PhD in the 30s with Wright and went back to China and trained an enormous number of students, primarily herpetologists, and finally Carl Schmidt at Chicago. So now let's look at just a few, I just have 3 more slides of people to show you. Here's one of Cornell's greatest and most influential graduates, and perhaps you've never heard of Ching Pi or Ping Chi, depending on whether you're giving it the Western or Eastern order of those words. Notice his original name was something different. It was Ping Chi Chai. The family name, the surname, is actually Chai. You'll see why he changed it in just a minute. He attended Peking University. In 1908, well, prior to 1908, the Boxer Rebellion, when the Chinese attacked various foreign enclaves in China and then lost, and they had to pay indemnities to the Western powers plus Japan. Well, Teddy Roosevelt was president at the time, and he decided the best thing to use the money for, it was $15 million, which was a lot of money in those days, rather than just put it in the general treasury, smart as he was, he said, well, let's use this money to train Chinese students in America and send them back to China so they can help develop the country. And so they funded all these scholarships. Well, Xi Ping took the exams not under his own surname. And this was actually fairly common because students were embarrassed that they might fail the exam. And so they used some other name. And in this case, he used his given names as Xi Ping. So he took the exams in 1909, passed them, came to Cornell, and of course he couldn't come to Cornell and tell them, well, he was some other name. So he had to continue using this made-up name that he used, made-up or changed name that he used for his exam. Well, Cornell liked him a lot, as you can see here. He earned a bachelor's degree in agriculture in 1913. Here's his graduation picture from undergraduate school, and then he stayed on to take a PhD in entomology. And that handwriting you see there is a note. I have the note right here. This is a note to the dean of the graduate school. In those days, you had to request your PhD. It was very formal. And you also had to put some money on the table. So let me just read it to you. This is to Dean Crichton. Whereas I have completed all the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, except for publication of my thesis, whereas I have just given a deposit to the treasurer of the university that I will publish the said thesis within 2 years from this date, I hereby respectfully request the degree be conferred upon me before the publication of my thesis. And apparently he got his money back, let's assume. But while he was at Cornell, he was in contact with Chinese students at other universities. And in those days, most of the Chinese students went to Cornell and Michigan. In fact, at that time, Cornell was the primary place in this country that Chinese students went to. Why? Well, we're talking about a developing country that needs agriculture and engineering, right? To build bridges and buildings and crops. So they came primarily to Cornell. Now, once they got here, they might change their majors, just like students do today. China's most famous philosopher of the 20th century came here as an agriculture student and then switched to philosophy a little later. But these Chinese students realized that China didn't have any scientific societies, so they started one. The Science Society of China was not founded in China, it was founded in the United States by Chinese students. And so when they got their degrees and went back to China, they took the society, so to speak, with them. At that time, there were no departments of biology at any university in China, so Ping Chi founded the first one at Nanking University in 1921. You may know that the earliest cooperative arrangement that Cornell has with any Chinese university is Nanking University. Not an accident. He then founded the Institute of Biology of the Science Society of China the next year. And even more importantly, in 1928, he founded the Fan Memorial Institute in Peking. And this was the forerunner of what is now the Chinese Academy of Sciences, Academia Sinica. I mean, what an influence he had in science and biology in particular in his own country. But in addition to this, he trained a large number of students in zoology in many disciplines, morphology, physiology, entomology, etc., including half a dozen of what became the leading herpetologists of the day. Now, the next Cornell example is really an example of what sometimes happens, where some discovery or theoretical understanding is made simultaneously by two different people. Wallace and Darwin's work on natural selection comes to mind. Well, here's another example, and a very important discovery. These two people, one of whom was a Cornell graduate, Ray Coles, are the co-discoverers of behavioral thermoregulation. Behavioral thermoregulation is the ability of reptiles and some other organisms to regulate their body temperature independent of the environment temperature. So, for example, if you have an organism that comes out of its burrow in the morning and it might be rather cold, it will position itself, as you see this lizard sitting on a rock in the morning, in order to soak up the sun's rays, warm up its body, or even more important, to warm up its brain so it can become active. Later in the day, the problem is cooling off. And so here you see a lizard right in the tip top of this tree trying to catch as much of the breeze as possible. And here's a lizard, if you can see this well enough, that's lifting its arms and legs and head off the substrate, off the hot substrate, as a way to cool itself. So they use behavioral means to regulate their body temperature at a level that's appropriate for them and different from the environment. Well, Coles was a student of Albert Wright, got his PhD in 1929, faculty member at UCLA. His interest was the adaptation of animals to arid environments. And by the way, he was born in South Africa, where his father had gone as a missionary and then came back to the United States for his education. His first publication on thermoregulation was in 1939. That date will be important in just a moment. And it was Ray Coles who actually coined these terms that we use all the time today in our physiology books of endotherm and ectotherm. The endotherms being birds and mammals, and ectotherms being reptiles, amphibians, fish, and others. The other person involved is Alexei Sergeyev, a Russian, shown here, graduate of Moscow State University, and became a faculty member there. He did some incredibly wonderful work on the origin of viviparity, etc. And notice he discovered and published his work in thermoregulation the very same year. These people did not know of one another at all. This was a total coincidence that they made the same discovery, obviously making it with very different species of reptiles, but they made it and published it in the very same year. Now, Sergeyev is unfortunately today very little known. And this is mainly because with the invasion of the Soviet Union by the Germans in 1941, he quickly joined up within weeks of the invasion and then was sent out to the front. He was captured, his company was captured by the German army, and after a few months, the Soviet troops rescued his company, and everyone in that company was then put on trial and imprisoned for not having died in defense of the motherland. And in Sergeyev's case, because he was a scientist and knew German, he actually could converse with some of the guards, and he was accused of collaboration. And at one point, he was sentenced to die by firing squad, but it was commuted to time in prison. But, as you can see, he died at the age of 31. He was imprisoned in the Gulag, the slave labor, one of the slave labor camps. He became very ill, and he was despondent, and he eventually hanged himself. And because of the trial, all of his remaining stock of the book that he published were all destroyed. Now this next person is one of the most inspiring and yet tragic cases. And for reasons you'll see in a minute, I think it's almost a Cornell story. This is Worth Hamilton Weller, a very precocious young man. He reminds me of certain Cornell undergraduates that I know these days at Cornell, active in the Herpetology Club. Well, Worth Weller published a dozen papers in herpetology, essentially all of them before he graduated from high school. The Cincinnati Museum of Natural History, the director there, Ralph Dury, I actually knew him when I was a youngster, had a junior division of the society, which had its own meetings and its own collections and its own journal. And Weller became the editor. He was also the business manager. They had a printing press down in the basement, and so they printed off the journal. And they did their own research. They did field work in Tennessee and Kentucky, North Carolina. And Weller discovered 4 new species of amphibians and reptiles while he was still a high school student. And the last of these was a spectacular new salamander that you see here. It may not look spectacular to you, but to the herpetologists in the audience, this is now called Plethodon welleri, named for him after his premature death. Well, he had discovered this after his junior year in high school, and Ralph Dury, the director of the museum, took this bunch of young kids in his car down to Linville, North Carolina, and to this mountain. This is Grandfather Mountain. And this reaches a height in excess of a mile. And any of you who have been there today will know it's a rather treacherous mountain even today. And now there's a road going to the top of it. And there's a sign at the top that says, "Be careful, you are on the most dangerous mountain in eastern North America." Very steep-sided slopes, and because they're moist and moss-covered, they're very slippery. Well, they went down within a week or so after he graduated from high school, and they arrived late in the day, and Weller didn't want to help the others make camp. He wanted to go off and get more specimens of his salamander, and a storm was brewing that night, and so off he goes, and by 11 o'clock he hadn't come back. And so Dr. Dury goes to the local police, and they sent out search parties the next day, and they eventually found his body. Apparently he had, in the darkness, he had actually collected some of the animals. He had them in a sack hanging from his belt. He had slipped apparently off of one of the cliffs to his death. These animals are only found, by the way, at the very, very top above 1,500 meters up there in the spruce forest. Well, he was just 18 years old. He had just turned 18 the month before. What's the possible Cornell connection? Well, here it is. Some fact, some supposition. His father graduated from Cornell. And there were few PhD programs in herpetology at that time, essentially 4: Harvard, Cornell, Michigan, and Berkeley. And something tells me that he would have ended up at Cornell, especially because Albert Wright was in his prime, and of all of the PhD programs in herpetology at that time, this was the place to go to study amphibians. So I think it's highly likely he would have been another one of Albert Wright's wonderful students. Well, these are just a small sample of the 2 volumes together, 437 biographies. It's an incredibly broad range of careers that are represented. We have, of course, many physicians, academicians, amateurs, of course. There are also, on reviewing them the other night, 2 pharmacists, several members of the nobility, a poet, a politician, 2 diplomats, several clergymen and priests, university administrators, including 4 presidents. The presidents of Michigan, Hiroshima, Göttingen, and Vienna, if my memory serves me, museum and zoo curators, of course, and military officers like John LeConte. Some of these people devoted their life's fortune to zoology and especially to herpetology, and a few of them went bankrupt doing it. Especially the books and the illustrations that they produced were extremely expensive to produce. Others accomplished this work despite severe physical handicaps or prolonged illnesses. More than a few lost their lives pursuing their subject. One of them was actually murdered in the field by his guide, a turtle expert, a German. Others were imprisoned. One was executed, and others committed suicide. And yet, despite these sad parts of the stories, there is much in the lives of these people and their careers to admire and to inspire, even today. Thank you very much.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.